Hello? I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to my channel, where every story is a step toward better English and deeper emotions. Take a deep breath, and let's begin. Sometimes the biggest questions come from within. What happened to you? The bed was still warm. The blanket, shaped by my body, was wrinkled. When I got up, it slowly slipped to the floor. It felt like the bed was looking at me sadly and whispering, "Poor you. Even the time you wake up is decided by your work. Where is your freedom?" The room was dark, with only a little pale light coming from outside. Inside me, there was a familiar feeling. I didn't want to wake up. But I had to get up. I sat on the edge of the bed. Still half asleep, I rubbed my eyes. I got up slowly and walked towards the bathroom. When my feet touched the floor, I felt its coolness all over my body. I stood in front of the mirror. My face was pale. My eyes, they looked empty. Who is this man? As a child, I never imagined I would become someone like this. I turned on the tap. I put my hands under it. When I splashed the water on my face, it left a burning feeling on my skin. The water didn't just wake up my face, it shook something deep inside me too. I left the bathroom quickly. I stood in front of the closet and stared blankly for a while. Nothing inside had changed over the years. The same faded shirts, the same old sweaters. Their colors were almost the same, all stuck somewhere between gray and black. I reached out for a sweater. At that moment, it felt like the closet whispered to me, "I thought you were going to work, not visiting a graveyard." I stood still and stared for a while. Maybe it was really mocking me. Maybe I had become so lonely that I could even argue with a closet. I grabbed my coat and walked towards the door. Loneliness was there, as always, waiting by the door. It said nothing, but gently wrapped itself around my neck. When I opened the front door, the air was cold and a light rain was falling. I put my hands in my pockets. Lowering my head a little, I started to walk. The familiar smell of rain, a mix of concrete, soil, and old rooftops, filled my nose. With every step, my shoes echoed on the wet ground. As I got closer to the metro station, the sharp smell of dampness hit my nose. I showed the card in my pocket as I passed through the turnstile at the entrance. I stepped onto the escalator. The same station, the same train, the same faces. Most people were looking down at their phones. A few had headphones on, shutting out the world completely. I was in a crowd where no one really saw anyone else, full of eyes trying not to meet mine. When the train came, I first heard a low rumble. Then the lights appeared around the curve of the tunnel. As the train approached, I took a few steps back. The doors opened. People quietly flowed out, and then others took their place. The train was moving, but it felt like time had stopped. Why had there never been someone I could really talk to? Someone whose presence didn't make me feel incomplete. Someone I could fall in love with. Someone I could build a true friendship with. Someone who would be the first person I thought of in the morning, and whose voice I would want to hear when coming home at night. In this crowd, in this city, with so many people around me, why had I never truly reached even one person? At that moment, a familiar voice rose inside me. It was harsh, full of questions, a voice I had grown used to over time, but one that still tightened my chest every time I heard it. Who do you think you are? Who am I? I'm someone who pays rent for a one-room flat that has soaked in the smell of dampness. Someone who lives among second-hand furniture, with walls slowly falling apart and a ceiling turned yellow with time. Someone who lives while forgetting who they are. Someone who has lost their connection with friends. The people I once walked the streets with at night, laughing for hours at things that didn't even make sense. Now we only send each other quiet, "Hey, how are you?" messages. They reply, but we don't really talk. The truth is, we don't have anything left to talk about. My mom. She still calls. Most of the time I forget to answer. Sometimes I see her name and silence the call. I feel a bit of guilt, yes, but it's only a passing feeling, because I've gotten used to it, used to forgetting, used to ignoring, used to not caring. My mom is the only person who still calls me, and even she, I push away. Where did I go wrong? Was the mistake made from the very beginning by crashing into the wrong address at birth? Maybe, for some people, the starting line of life was drawn wrong. Was free will just an illusion? If your choices are limited by the house you are born into and the opportunities you have, then what choice do you really have? Not everyone's story started the same, and we were struggling inside this unfairness. Some people started the race 10 steps ahead, while others dragged their feet with chains. Then someone would come and say, "Everyone has an equal chance." Equality. It only existed on paper. In reality, it had nothing to do with justice. As the train shook and continued on its way, the voices inside me grew quieter. My thoughts became heavy for a while and gave way to a silent numbness. It felt like my mind was tired from thinking too much. At that moment, I jumped a little at the sound of a lively voice next to me. And then the T-Rex was the strongest, but sometimes it couldn't catch its prey because its arms were too short, Daddy. I turned my head slightly and looked. In front of me was a small boy, about 5 or 6 years old. He was wearing a red coat, and his pants had a cartoon character on the knees. His eyes were shining. He wanted to tell so many things that the words were falling from his mouth one after another. He waved his hands with excitement, and his voice rose above the noise of the train. At that moment, something moved inside me. The dull noise of the carriage, the vibrations from the tracks, and the reflection of my face in the glass. All of them were pushed into the background. Only the boy's voice and his bright, pure gaze towards his father remained. He smiled as he acted out the T-Rex's short arms with his tiny hands, looking joyfully into his father's eyes. His father listened without looking away, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking a small question to make his son's words even more lively. In that moment, it felt like there was nothing else in the world except the two of them. Even though the carriage was crowded, it was as if the father and son were breathing in their own little world. And I stood outside it all, like someone watching from behind a cold window. When I was a child, I always had so many things to talk about. Sometimes it was a friend from school, sometimes a cartoon I had watched, and sometimes just something silly I had imagined. Sometimes I would draw something. My pencils would be scattered all over the table, my notebook would stay open, and I would wait for my dad with excitement. I wanted to show him. I would wait eagerly for that moment, the sound of the door opening, the creak of his shoes, and him walking into the living room. But he would come, and most of the time he would just pass by. He would have a bag in his hand and the tiredness of the day on his face. He was never really there. For years I compared him to other fathers, the ones who took their children to the park, waited for them after school, and cheered during football games. The ones who helped with homework, signed notebooks, and smiled when they looked into their children's eyes on birthdays. And every time, I felt his absence even more deeply inside me. When I was little, I always thought it was because I wasn't enough, because I wasn't smart enough, because I didn't talk in an interesting way, because I wasn't funny enough. I believed for a long time that if I were a better child, he would have been a better father. But I don't think that way anymore. Years have passed. And now, as I reach the age he was back then, I understand his tiredness better. Now I know what it means. I know what it feels like to collapse into the same chair every evening, to open your eyes to the same alarm sound every morning, to count the coins in your pocket just to make it to the end of the month. All of it feels familiar to me now. And that's why I can't be angry with him anymore. Maybe there is still some sadness inside me. Maybe the child inside me still wants to fix the things that were missing. But now I know that not being angry is something different. Because sometimes you can only understand someone else's tiredness when you get tired yourself. For years I was angry with him. I kept it inside, saying nothing, but it came from a deep place. I carried the feeling of emptiness, neglect, and lack that I had felt as a child for many years. Is there anything heavier than a child not being noticed by their own father? I guess nothing leaves a mark like being ignored while trying to prove your existence. Those marks slowly become a part of your personality. Your voice cracks. Your eyes turn away and your confidence is replaced by a quiet sadness inside. But now, at my age, when I try to see through my father's eyes instead of the child's, some things start to make more sense. I suddenly thought about my father's childhood. As far as I know, my grandmother, his mother, was a woman who tried to survive on her own. She had no husband. The house expenses, the responsibility for the children, the bills, the missing groceries, the laundry that needed to be washed. Everything was on her shoulders. I don't know if my father was ever able to really live his childhood. He never talked about it. Back then, I didn't understand, but now I think maybe there was nothing to tell. Maybe there were no moments he thought were worth sharing. Maybe no one ever asked him, "How are you today?" Maybe no one ever patted his head or said, "Well done," for a drawing he made. Maybe there was food cooking at home, but the table wasn't a place where people gathered, laughed, and talked. It was just a surface where you sat to fill your stomach. If a child grows up without ever feeling loved, how can that child love someone else later? Can someone who never learned how to be loved really know how to love? And if a child grows up without ever living their own childhood, what happens when they have a child of their own? I guess my father was never able to be a child. And now I understand that while I was trying to be a child to him, he couldn't be an adult to me. Because inside him, there was still a child who had never truly lived. Maybe this realization doesn't bring me peace, but now I see things more clearly. I can look at him not with anger, but with a tired kind of understanding. Back then, I couldn't do that, but now I can. because now I see the same traces of tiredness on my own face, too. When I was a child, my father had eyes that never really looked at me. In those eyes, I saw indifference. But now, when I think about it, maybe all I would have seen was tiredness. Back then, the silence felt like anger to me. But now I can understand that sometimes there are thousands of words hidden inside silence, and that staying silent can also be a form of helplessness. At that time, it felt like he didn't care about me. But now I think maybe he was just trying to stay standing inside himself. As the train slowed down, the familiar screech of metal against the rails made people a little uneasy. They started gathering their things, picking up their bags and checking their phones again. Some looked impatient because they wanted to get off before missing their stop. But I stayed where I was, still and buried deep inside myself. I stood up slowly. Without noticing, my hand had reached for the metal bar. I felt the coldness under my fingers, but inside, I felt warmer than the world outside. Because during this journey, something had changed. Even if it couldn't be seen, I could feel it very clearly. I turned back for one last look. The boy was still talking, still telling his story. Words were pouring out of his mouth, and his eyes were still lost in his father's gaze. The man was still there, not just with his body, but with his mind, his heart, and all his attention. They were living that moment together, just as it should be. I wanted to freeze that moment like a photo and keep it in my memory, so that one day I could return to it inside myself. Because I realized that what I had been chasing all my life was something like this. To be seen, to be heard, to have someone truly be there. What do you think he is feeling now? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your ideas. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that improve your English. With love, see you in the next story.